Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large. This is episode number 63, brought to you on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, and of course on video here on YouTube, if you're caring to watch this podcast. I am very happy with the progress we've been making so far, and this week I have we have the return of Jon Atack. It was months and months ago that I first interviewed him with Ruth on this podcast about the Open Minds Foundation, which was a new website and organization that he had started, which does research into undue influence, mind control, things like that. Jon actually wrote a book called Opening Minds, and we discussed that book and the website. Well, things have moved forward since then, and of course, Jon Atack, as some of you may or may not know, was the author of a very famous book in the Scientology world, the ex-Scientology world, I should say, called A Piece of Blue Sky. And this is one of the seminal, most important books that was written back in the 80s. And he, of course, also assisted Russell Miller with research on Russell Miller's book, Barefaced Messiah, which is by far the most authoritative biography of L. Ron Hubbard that exists. So I reached out to Jon because I wanted to get an update on the Open Minds Foundation and the work he was doing on that, and also discuss some Scientology things with him, because you may have noticed a distinct lack of Scientology in the news since the release of Louis Theroux's documentary, right? My Scientology movie that came out in the UK and will be coming here to the United States, I believe, next year. And Scientology's been real quiet about that. So I talked to Jon about why that is, or what's going on with that. And of course, they haven't been so quiet about Leah Remini's new upcoming documentary on A&E about Scientology, or upcoming series of interviews about Scientology. They've been bad-mouthing Leah. So Scientology isn't totally rolling over and playing dead, but the lack of attack dog tactics against Louis Theroux was surprising to me. So anyway, we have a lot to discuss in this interview, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's go ahead and get started with it. Jon, thank you very much for being on the podcast again. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Chris. My pleasure.
So I thought we might discuss the Open Minds Foundation, get a little bit of update on that, because I think when we last spoke, you had just written Opening Minds, your book, yep. And this was just kind of getting going. And I think the website was just going online like the week we did our podcast or something. And of course, it's got lots of content and much improved and all that. So what's the update on that, and how's it going?
Well, the website went up in about July, and really, it's been an incredible thing. I've worked on this. I started on it back in about 1991 when I realized that the dynamics of a cult group are the same as the dynamics of most abusive relationships. So that if you look at gangs, paedophile rings, human traffickers, and certain political parties, without mentioning any names, you find that the same behavior is taking place. I mean, if you want to reduce it, then what we're looking at is bullying. What we're looking at is people who have a totalist or totalitarian attitude towards others and a narcissistic view of themselves and want to basically control other people. And that's the same whether it's an abusive relationship between just two people or whether it's a country like North Korea. I mean, I'm rather bothered by events in China at the moment, showing that there was a report yesterday on the enforcement of the one child, now two child rule, and that they actually go to a house where a woman is pregnant and they force her to have an abortion. And that's part of the way that state works. And from my perception, that is utterly, utterly horrifying. So wow. It happens, on a scale all the way along. And I read a great deal about terrorism. Indeed, before 9/11, I became interested in the Baader-Meinhof, the IRA and various Islamist groups. And it seemed to me that the difference is a sliding scale that has violence at one end, and that we in the UK have a Coercive Control Act, which basically makes it illegal to bully your partner. There's
oh, really? That's law there now?
Yes, it came in at the end of last year, and there have been prosecutions, and there have been people sent to prison for it. It brought up this argument that, there's a chap called Evan Stark at Rutgers who's written a book called Coercive Control, where he's saying that the emphasis upon violence has been the wrong emphasis, because violence is the outcome of coercive control. And by the time you've got there, all sorts of horrible things have usually happened. So I think putting that focus and trying to say we need a society that is not governed by narcissists, if such a thing is possible. The footnote is that Emory University a year or two back did a study of 42 presidents leading up to, but not including, Barack Obama, and said that all of the popular ones were technically narcissists. So, there's a bad situation there. I don't think it's necessary to have self-obsessed, malicious bullies in charge of the world. I think warfare is the inevitable outcome of such behavior. So we need to have a better awareness. We need to refine our political systems so that politicians perhaps need some job qualifications, perhaps a little bit of psychiatric testing, before we let them get their fingers on the buttons, But it's all around.
That's quite revolutionary thought, Jon. I really don't. I don't know about some of these wild, harebrained ideas of yours. These sound like quite out there on the edge.
It's mad, isn't it? Totally
it's
mad.
Quite mad. Yes.
And so the idea of Open Minds from the beginning was to bring together people with expertise from different areas, and it's forced me over the last 2 years to really read a lot of books and have a lot of conversations, and realize, having spent a lifetime studying coercive control, learning how to do it in Scientology for 9 years, learning how to hypnotize people for fun and money. Didn't have much fun, didn't make any money, but heck. Then, standing up for a dozen years against Scientology and really becoming fascinated with how it works. And it struck me that most people who leave, somebody asked me something about Kerry Gleason at the bunker. I think it was Chuck Beatty asked me about Kerry Gleason and said, we really need Kerry Gleason's memoirs, the former executive director international. I said, well, I've only met Kerry once. He came to my house for dinner one night, and after dinner, I thought, well, we'll start the conversation. I'll see what he wants to tell me. And I said, what do you think of Scientology? He said, it's shit. And that was it. That was the whole statement about Scientology. Well, that's great. But at the time, Kerry was still earning his living using the Hubbard admin tech as a management consultant. So there was this.
What?
Yeah. And, I'm sure he's over it by now. But it's that thought that all you have to do is say, I'm no longer a Scientologist, and it'll all evaporate. Whereas, in fact, what you've been subjected to is really significant behavioral conditioning. What L. Ron Hubbard, in fact, in his letter to John F. Kennedy in 1963 called the most effective brainwashing system ever devised, which I think was and is probably still true, though there may be some of the newer cults are actually getting a little bit more significant, because Hubbard studied 40s hypnotism, and that's the basis of Scientology, and things like the Taylor management system, the time and motion management system, where the whip is cracked and you have statistics for everything, which has long been proven to be massively inefficient. It's much better to trust people. It's much better to, do that than micro-controlling everything. I mean, witness when I left Scientology in '83, Jesse Prince at Toronto last year, he said when people left, there were more people outside than inside. And when you looked at the tiny little groups in East Grinstead, which had, you had the Advanced Stability Centre with 5 people working there, they were producing more auditing hours than St. Hill, which had 200 people.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
It doesn't work. It's awful stuff. But the problem is it stays in your head. And I became absolutely fascinated with that. That threw me into, reading William Sargent and Cialdini and Lifton and all of the usual suspects, through to, meeting Steve Hassan in the late 80s and reading his work, Margaret Singer, Jolly West, lots of terrible people who were
Oh yes,
anti-religious
all
hate
suppressive people.
campaigners.
Yes, they're all the worst sorts that we cavort and hang out with. Yes.
It was wild, actually, meeting so many senior SPs. I mean, Jolly West was the #1 SP
Oh yeah.
as a psychiatrist, and he is really one of the most charming and certainly the most intelligent human being I've ever met. The time I spent with him was just incredible, because he was so stimulating, and he was absolutely humble and pleasant as well. And Margaret as well. Margaret, by the time I met her, had given free counsel to 2,000 ex-cult members. Never charged any fee. And
well, no, Scientology has nothing but bad mouthing for those people because they're undoing what Scientology does.
Yeah, the criminal accuses others of things he himself is doing, as L. Ron Hubbard said. In fact, I used to have one of those pictures of him from the Auditor, which had that written underneath at my desk, just to remind me why I was doing what I was doing. The overt doth speak loud in accusation.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you have all of the generalizations, which SPs use, like psychs, for example. And they're all in a big conspiracy. Have you ever met two psychologists who shared the same opinion? Because I haven't.
Exactly.
So this huge conspiracy.
Exactly. Well, let's go back to the Open Minds Foundation, because I'm actually very curious right now. What are your now that you've established, right? You're clearly up and running. Your website's running. There are articles on there. There's some very interesting and good resources there for people who are interested in finding out about or recovering from destructive cults. I think you're really turning it into something like that. And I'm curious, what are your immediate goals with this now? What is it you want to get done, like in the near future?
I mean, the first thing is to broadly educate the public about mind control, which is an expression I'm not particularly keen on, I must say, thought reform, coercive control, undue influence, as the lawyers call it, and to show that this is something that's happening every day in everybody's life, whether it be advertisers, political spin doctors. I personally think that what's happened in the last 15, 20 years is the spin doctors have come out and said, hey, we're running politics. And they were behind the scenes before. And we're all going, you, the people that make stuff up and manipulate us, you're in charge now. So nobody trusts politics anymore. I think the thing is to get out a basic educational message. And the first part of that is, for me, was writing Opening Minds and saying, well, I've been swimming around in this stuff for 25 years, and it's about time I clarified my thoughts and shared them with other people. I had quite a surprise, actually. I have a friend who was a senior Hubbard aide many years ago, who's been gone from the church for 30 years and who spent considerable time trying to understand coercive psychology. And I keep trying to have conversations with him. He's a very good friend. Keep trying to have conversations with him, and he closes down the conversation. That thing that is the denial of the ex-member. I don't need to talk about that because I'm fully enlightened now. I know everything because Ron Hubbard gave me a certificate saying I know everything. I am not really sure how this works. I personally, follow Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, who says I know less every day because that is my experience of life, realizing that there is more and more and more to understand and that I will never get that. And so we're part of a collaborative effort to understand and to behave in a better way. So the thing is, firstly, to get a textbook out there. We've also, my colleague Bonnie Zeman has just, who's a former Jehovah's Witness, who is a fully trained counselor up in Canada. She's put out a new book as well, talking about recovery.
Oh, good.
My next project is something in your neck of the woods. It's a book about critical thinking. And yeah, because we're not, I'm not aware of any text that really, and I've looked at courses on it. I've DeBelly's work or Thules's work back in the 30s. There are so many people who've thought about this and made amazing contributions, but there needs to be something that the average 5-year-old, 10-year-old, 15-year-old can see. So we're working on, I'm working with Yuval Laor, who you know very well.
Yep.
Preparing a primer, which is really aimed at 14-year-olds, that I have a graphic novelist I'm trying to include in the project. So it'll be, 30 pages long with a cartoon on every page. But to boil down, what are the simple things, that we can do to understand this problem? I'm very happy about Ira Chalef's book, Intelligent Disobedience, which is a wonderful, straightforward book. He's put up a fantastic little video called Blink Think. If you look up Blink Think Choice Voice through Google, you'll get this little, and it's a video for 5-year-olds. It's basically saying if somebody says something horrible that doesn't seem right, blink and think, and then make a choice and voice that choice. So you go, that sounds like nonsense to me, or whatever. But teaching very small children that they do have this right, which our education system, let alone our cults, says we shouldn't have. That obedience is considered such a significant concept in humanity, perhaps because our education system, of course, was born in Prussia to make soldiers. After they were defeated by Napoleon, the Prussians created the first universal education system to make people obedient. Britain followed suit to, get the children away from their mums so their mums could work in the factories, but very much, with the Boy Scout movement and things like this, to create obedience. And it's such a stupid idea, because if you had a world where people went, no, I'm not going to do that because it's wrong, rather than the kind of Nuremberg Befehl ist Befehl, orders are orders, I'm just doing as I'm told. If we all realized that we are responsible for our actions, no matter what, then we could have quite a different world.
I could not agree with you more on those points, and the idea of a primer or textbook for young people on critical thinking is quite exciting. A lot of these projects sound awesome, and definitely should be supported. And this is all moving in exactly the direction I want to see things moving. So I think you're definitely talking good things here right now. Curious, just not to get into a big long segue on this, but what do you mean the Prussian school of? Is that a thing? Is that? Did you do some historical research or something on that?
Yeah, I actually the book I've just published is actually extracted from a larger and far less comprehensible volume, which is called Waking Reason, which I've been working on most of my life, it seems. Basically. And there is a chapter on education. So I went off and I read histories of education, theories of education. And it really is, that the Prussians, I think it was 1804, they're defeated by Napoleon and we're the Prussians, you can't beat us. And they reckon it was because the kids were not being brought up to instantly obey. And so they were the first country in the world, before they took Germany over, they were the first country in the world to introduce free education for all children, universal education.
Really?
Yep. And that was the reason. And again, if you look to the Boy Scout movement and its origins at the beginning of the 20th century, it's because Baden-Powell had gone to South Africa and seen how dreadful the condition of British soldiery was. And so he wanted to train little boys so they'd be good soldiers later on. It's a curiosity, and I'm sure somebody will challenge me on this, but my understanding is that the Hitler Youth were previously known as the Boy Scouts of Germany, which is not in any way to confuse the two ideas. I think the Boy Scout movement is a largely positive thing.
Right.
I've met Scoutmasters who I did admire, so I'm not making any criticism of that. But the problem was that this way of organizing people and getting them to follow orders and march in step, just given what we know now about persuasion, putting people into uniform, getting them to sing songs together, getting them to march together, it does create unity. And that's not necessarily a good thing if you want people to think critically. You want people to be able to say, I disagree.
Well, that's very interesting, because I was just having a conversation the other day with someone about the school system and the inefficiencies and problems with that it's a systemic problem. It is not a money problem as such. Yes, there are money problems. Teachers are woefully underpaid when you look at the system that we have.
Teachers should be the most important people in society, not
Not the least,
Yeah.
exactly. And so we have a number of systemic issues with our educational system, with our universal education system. You guys have a system. Ours comes from yours, I would imagine, or mostly from yours, and yours is now, I'm finding out, coming from Russia, which is very interesting. And what you're talking about as a fundamental to education being to create a yes sir, no sir mentality makes a lot of sense, because the model we have moves people in that direction. And the thing that we're finding that it's inadequate for is the individual attention to the individual who's having trouble or problems keeping up. And people have this idea that, well, this thing is supposed to educate all individuals. And if you think that's what it's modeled on, you might have some false ideas about how this thing was put together and why it was put together. So maybe solving this problem requires, and I've been putting a lot of thought into this, a real rework of it at a systemic level, at a very fundamental level. I think we've all been brought up with this idea, and so we can't really think with any other way to do it.
Yes, exactly. It's like, being a second generation Scientologist and being released into the world and going, well, actually, this stuff's nonsense. What am I meant to believe?
Exactly. And it requires a whole reboot up here to figure out, well, wait a minute, if this isn't it. And I think this is, again, this is interesting, because it leads into something else I've been thinking about lately. Of Elon Musk talks about a different way of thinking, right? I think he calls it first priorities or something. But he says, people tend to think in analogies. They compare a new idea to old ideas, whereas when you really want to innovate, when you really want to move the ball down the road, you have to think in something totally different. And the example he gives is, Henry Ford didn't try to figure out how to make a faster horse buggy. Henry Ford went right back to the drawing board and came up with something completely new and different that nobody was thinking of.
Yeah.
Right.
And a way of making that thing that was fantastically efficient.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, Henry Ford, we know he didn't invent the car, but the ideas of this were new ideas. They were thinking, I guess, what we call outside the box. It's what is the term we all use now for it, but it's like an analogy-free way of thinking. Let's not try to improve what we've already got. When it's really not working at a systemic level, we need to come up with something totally new.
Yeah.
And I think with education, nobody's really quite figured that out yet.
I think there are people who have, and certainly back in the 80s, there was quite a movement in the US. There's a guy called Matthew Lipman, who was a professor at Columbia University. He taught philosophy. And then one day he said, by the time I get them, it's too late. By the time they're 18,
that's right.
It's too late. And he started working on education for infants that would be cooperative and collaborative. So rather than, I'm an authority and I'm pouring information into your head, we are engaged in a mutual exploration. I am older than you and have more experience, but I will learn from you along the way. There was an incredible documentary called Socrates for 6-year-olds made in the 80s. And they showed two facilitators who'd been trained in his approach with children. One was with 6-year-olds, and the idea was that on average, these 6-year-olds were 6 months behind. They did 6 months with a facilitator, and it's not teaching. It's not, here's the blackboard and this is what you've got to memorize and here are the tests. We know actually that exams and tests are negative. They destroy people's confidence, and they teach people how to pass tests rather than doing anything in the real world.
That's right.
And create all sorts of anxiety disorders later on, no doubt. Well, they don't do that. They sit down and the facilitator proposes an idea. And the one I remember is them saying, do we need a brain? And you've got 6-year-olds, and one of them going, well, I think we need a brain because otherwise we fall over. And then the next one either says, I agree or I disagree, and adds a point. Everybody in the circle gets to contribute. At the end of 6 months, these 6-year-olds were 6 months ahead of their peers.
Right. That's what I was predicting would happen. Yeah.
They did it with 15-year-old latchkey kids in New Jersey who were in the school of last resort. If they were dropped from this one, they were gone. It was anticipated that they would all become crack dealers, pimps, and the usual sort of job opportunities in New Jersey. And in fact, after doing this class, and it was sort of, well, what would your mum do if you got pregnant? She'd kill me, and the conversation would go around. All of those kids went on to senior high school. Every kid in the class went on to senior high school because they were given control over their education and an understanding that, why are we here? What are we doing? It's to pass exams so that we'll be successful in life.
Right.
Well, you're doing mathematics so that, and geometry so that when you're fixing a car engine, you'll be able to do this. There's a thing called mind mapping over here, a guy called Tony Buzan who does this, and he takes kids and he says, well, this is why you're doing these subjects. What is your aspiration? Let's connect it to the subjects you need. So there are a lot of people working in this field, but the system itself is stuck. You also have this thing that gets me that, people tell me, John, you had an education, you went to university, you did all of this. And I have to say, no, I left school when I was 17. And I had a couple of years in art college after that, 9 years in Scientology. And I love information. And what I came to realize pretty early on was that school is a way of destroying curiosity.
Right.
Making learning boring and tedious.
That's right.
And so if I go back to my peers, and I did go to a fairly celebrated school briefly before things went wrong, and I had to walk out at the age of 14, but we won't get into that. So, but I'm sure that if I go out to my peers, several of whom went to Oxford and Cambridge, that my understanding of the basic subjects we studied is better than theirs, because I didn't just, pass an exam. In fact, I didn't pass many exams. I was interested in those subjects. And
right.
So my knowledge of history, geography, whatever, is based on fascination. And I think that we've taken away from teachers their right to enjoy their job. We've given them a curriculum that's enforced on them. In the UK, it's terrible. The curriculum is absolutely fixed. So when you are 14, you will study Macbeth.
Right.
Shakespeare. Now, all the Shakespeare plays to study, with the great suicide soliloquy, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and all that, rather than giving them something that's fun, engaging them and getting them involved and allowing the teachers to be creative. Because heck, conformity isn't as useful to society as creativity.
Right.
And the tendency in university, therefore, is to put blinkers on. So this is the way we look at the subject. I was fascinated as 20, 30 years ago when I started to seriously study psychology to find that many of the eminent people hadn't studied psychology. B.F. Skinner, who I'm not particularly keen on, but he studied English. Carl Rogers, the founder of Third Force Humanistic Psychology, studied agriculture. Bateson, who had a tremendous effect and sadly his work has been perverted into neurolinguistic programming, Bateson was an anthropologist. And the thought was, well, maybe if you're training somebody in a subject, you're restricting their ability to develop because you're saying these are the rules and laws. So, for example, when Barry Marshall, the doctor, said, I think ulcers are caused by a bacterium, it took him 10 years to persuade the medical profession because the textbooks say bacteria can't live in the stomach. That's a true fact. We now know that 95% of ulcers are caused by Helicobacter pylori. And he went on to say, I think heart disease is bacterial too. And we're still resisting that thought. But
I've
the Bible, and say this is the truth, and we have to
exactly. We're and getting back to undue influence and whatnot on this, because these are intimately related. People think we might be off in the fields right now, but we're actually talking about something intimately related to undue influence and mind control.
Yeah.
Education has everything to do with this. It has to do with when you have people, especially leaders, societal leaders, whose ideas of education are to use it to shape hearts and minds so that they will be more obedient, they will be more following, they will not ask a lot of questions. I think you get a system a lot like the one that we have, and it's ironic that the system's DNA prevents itself from being changed. Because it by its very nature, it creates compliant, people who just follow along with the system and don't think for themselves and don't think creatively. And so it's sort of it's a little bit of a trap. Not even a little bit of a trap. If I'm going to be real blunt and truthful about this, it's a trap. It's a system that keeps itself sustained for the subject of obedience, and it pains me to start talking in that direction, because it tends to go in a direction of conspiracy theory and this sort of thing, which I resist, because that itself is a trap too, because it's so, the international conspiracy theorist is such a simple-minded bloke, and the things that go on in the world are infinitely more complex than 12 puppet masters pulling all of our strings, But this business
at least 13.
Yeah, exactly. But this business of a systemic problem that self-perpetuates and keeps itself from changing, that's just that description is a reflection of reality, not conspiracy. We all are the conspirators. Yes. We're all the ones who are keeping it going, Yes.
Exactly.
And I think that, the work you're doing is trying to wake people up to this sort of thing,
Very much so, very much so. Martin Luther King said that the problem with the world is not the evil people, but the mediocre people, those who do nothing. And it, probably about 2 or 3% of the population are psychopaths, and probably about 2 or 3% of the population are empaths. And in between is the mass of humanity. And it doesn't have to be that way. I think the other thing is that we could make an enjoyable life for people. We're coming to an incredible change in humanity. We're already at the point where we know there will never be full employment. It's always been a myth, but with robotization through industry, looking at, say, Amazon, in their warehouses, they now have robots that move the things around. The driverless car is going to take the jobs of about 10% of people. And it's, all of this stuff's coming on. And the problem is that we don't have a system in place to say, well, how do we therefore distribute the largesse that this creates? Instead, as Naomi Klein points out, when Reagan became president, the average CEO earned, I think it was 43 times what the blue-collar worker was earning. By 2000, it was 411 times. And through the banking scandal, what we saw was the destruction of the world's economy through a small number of rapacious and greedy people who provided nothing of value and have basically left us all in this situation. This isn't, I believe in social capitalism, as opposed to the old patriarchal capitalism, which they're still suffering from, or the corporate capitalism, but a point where we're all involved democratically in a process that allows, everybody to get health care, because, hey, it's really stupid not having health care, because if you don't, then you are breeding diseases among the unhealthy, which the rich people will catch from their, Mexican immigrant slaves, or whatever these people are and how they feel and how they behave. We have to look after everybody.
Right. That's right. And it's a shame when I see people, especially I think here in the States, it's more common perhaps than I might maybe just be more aware of it because I'm in the States. But it seems that there is a mental disease of capitalismitis or something, where people are just fixated. And again, this is this self-perpetuating system. They grow up in this.
It's a new religious movement in the social.
Yeah, exactly. They can't think outside that box.
Yeah.
And the socialism is a dirty word, and and welfare is a dirty word, and caring about your fellow man is somehow bad because somehow America was built on rugged individualism, and therefore if you're not making your own way, then it's all then you're relying on a system, and therefore you're losing your freedom, or I don't know what the computations that go on are, but it's such a self-defeating philosophy. And real society defeating,
It is. And the perversity is that it's a piece of massive undue influence. You can trace it back to the 1930s when the New Deal was proposed, with the idea that corporate capitalism would be reined in and the state would, seek to be, for the benefit, governed by the people for the people, as someone once said. the National Association of Manufacturing launched a counter-campaign. They spent millions on it. The documents are all available. It's not a conspiracy theory. They got together to destroy the New Deal. And they, for example, put billboards up which gave us the catchphrase, the American way. The American way is
right.
And the idea is that the American way is capitalism. The American way is everybody's free to feed off everybody else and take what they want. When you look at that conflict with the New Deal, which was a remarkable political idea, which grew around Roosevelt, I'm not sure that he had anything at all to do with it, but he was very good at giving fireside chats.
Yeah.
Some brilliant thinkers came along and said, we can make an equitable society. We can look after nature. We can promote the arts. All of these things were part of this package. Then World War II came, and the manufacturers won. And of course, as Eisenhower said, his last speech,
that's right,
the military-industrial complex.
Right.
And here we are, pouring trillions
exactly.
into people instead of making the world a better place.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Hey everyone, just wanted to take a quick break and let you know that I have merchandise for sale. This is critical thinking merchandise, and also, of course, some of it is not all related to critical thinking. Some of it's just kind of funny because I just tickled my funny bone and I thought I'd throw it up on a shirt or put it on a mug or whatever it is you'd like to do with it. It's available through spreadshirt.com at the link below. And it's a great way to not only get yourself some great merchandise for wearing or for drinking or whatever, but also a great way to support this channel and support my show here, the Sensibly Speaking podcast. It's at shop.spreadshirt.com/Chris Shelton. Critical merchandise for critical thinkers like you. Yeah, it's funny. We really are talking in an aligned direction with some of the ideas of conspiracy theorists, but we're not talking conspiracy theory. We're talking history and science, and we're talking undue influence and how it works on a mass level on populations, because it does work. And anybody who thinks that populations are not influenced by people who have ideas are simply not looking. I mean, we all go to Goebbels and history and Hitler, and we'll look at that. Well, there's your most extreme and, in a way, obvious example after the fact. But if we don't learn those lessons from those time periods and look at how it's done on us now, we're never going to be able to fight back against it, and I think that's probably the most important part of the work you guys are doing.
I think so. And as a footnote on that, Goebbels, when Edward Bernays read Goebbels' speeches, he said, he's stolen my ideas. So the basic ideas, there are three guys at the beginning of this. There's Ivy Lee, there's Walter Lippmann, and there's Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, who spoke to Freud about how you could use sex to make people buy things, which, by the way, doesn't actually work. But, it's nice.
You tell that to Madison Avenue, man. They won't stop.
Well, funnily, I was reading a thing last week where Advertising Age had actually reported on the 100 most successful campaigns of the 20th century. Only 8 of them had sex in either the image or the text. 92 of them did not. So, interesting. But in fact, Cialdini, who says that in his wonderful new Persuasion, fantastic book, recommend it to everybody. Got to read Influence first, but fantastic book.
I have both of those on my shelf on my to-read list.
Well, that's good enough, isn't it?
I'm just saying, I'm getting there.
Yeah. But I mean, I was on a plane flying to Chicago, as you do, long ago, and there were 2 Armenian Americans sat there in their 70s, and it was when Clinton was president, and it was when the Pinocchio stuff was up, that he was being accused of being Pinocchio, and they were Republicans. They were really pleased with this. Nice people. But then one of them said, my wife and I have 8 unnecessary surgical procedures, because we have health insurance. And then he said, but at least we don't have your socialist medicine. And you go, they can't even get what's going on here, because the kind of cult thinking, the influence is so great. I mean, in the US, right, the educational system came into being in the 1870s and 80s to homogenize immigrant populations, which it significantly failed to do. We still have Italian Americans and Latinos and African Americans. And we still have, rather than having a cultural diversity and a sharing of ethnicity, which you do find in Britain, if you want to go, half an hour up the road from me is Leicester, and every year you can go and celebrate Diwali with the Hindus there, which I personally think is wonderful. There is no aggression. There's no, we're better than you. You can do your Morris dancing and we'll have Diwali and we'll share. That hasn't really happened enough in the world. Instead, multiculturalism has meant, having leaflets at the doctors in 11 different languages and things like that, which is road signs. You go to South Africa and you really do have 11 languages. How anybody gets anywhere, I don't know. But it is, in fact, creating diversity and looking at, I agree with you, influence underlies everything. Influence is what we believe, how we persuade people. And the problem is that we're all of us susceptible, as you well know, to things like confirmation bias, where we'll only accept evidence that agrees with us, or cognitive dissonance, where if we feel a bit wobbly when somebody contradicts our belief in the greatness of Ron Hubbard or somebody, we can't talk about it. And opening people up and teaching them that it's really safe to discuss ideas, and that, if you talk to suppressive people, as I have very often, and of course I am one.
We're doing it right now. Both of us right now.
but of course it's one of those peculiar abbreviations, because of course the suppressive person is the ASP, or antisocial personality, and the SP is the social personality. This is another of Ron Hubbard's little twists that you don't notice at first, that he does these little things to you. So the social personalities, of course, have to be excluded from Scientology, because, hey, a social personality is able to communicate freely to anyone on any subject, unlike a Scientologist who's actually paid money for this capacity. But teaching people not to be scared of ideas, not to feel that they're going to be invaded by the little body thetans or demons of thought, that it's a wonderful thing to be disagreed with, to have your thoughts checked, not to be shouted at and railed against, but to have somebody go, well, that's an interesting idea. However, have you thought of this? Certainly in my life, that's a daily occurrence. Everybody I talk to offers me something that I don't know. And, between us, we explore, and it becomes, the great living universe experiment, as a friend of mine called his movement, or glue. That we are here, and it's an experiment, and we are here to, improve it, ameliorate, make it better, through discussion, conversation, and without the kind of authoritarian, I'm bigger than you, and that wonderful scene in Matilda where Danny DeVito looks down at his daughter and says, "I'm big and you're small." That notion of human relations needs to go. Having the bully and the slave. It's no good for us. It's no good for us. Exactly. And it is all a matter of influence. It's all a matter of influence.
Exactly. All right. Well, I'm gonna switch up topics right now, because I know if we don't get this in, somebody's gonna kill me. So let's talk about Scientology for a minute.
Scientology? Now, what's that?
Yeah, exactly. What's that? Actually, what I want to talk about a little bit is Scientology's present and future, okay? And I don't want to read too much into what's happening since going clear, but it sure seems to me like, okay, pardon the pun for us insiders here, but it seems like they're clamming up right now and are pretty quiet. And I don't know what you've noticed over there, but over here, it really seems like they've pulled in their flippers. For example, there hasn't really been any response to Louis Theroux's documentary that I have seen. How about over there? In the UK, anything?
I think what happened was that I put it back to Rich Behar's Cult of Greed article for Time, that there was a 20-year battle to silence Time, which cost tens of millions of dollars. Now, Scientology has billions, so it wasn't a problem. But something changed. I don't know if Miscavige thought that, Tom Cruise said, "Oh, the pictures of me are not looking right. We need to do this differently," or some, it was probably some spiritual cognition on Tom Cruise's part that said, "You've got to stop attacking people." So that when Janet Reitman came along, 20 years after the last book in English, which was my book, 20 years later, nothing had happened. And she pokes her head above the parapet with the Rolling Stone article, writes a book, goes bestseller, and Lawrence Wright then writes a better book. Despite saying that David Miscavige was left alone at East Grinstead. I think that's the only error I'm aware of so far, with that incredible Sarge Fouth statement that, Hubbard wanted him to kill him at the end.
Yes, that was an amazing get. Yes.
Yeah, which then goes on to Gibney's piece and on and on. What's happened in the media is that they're not frightened anymore. Now that the lawyers are not, I worked on a couple of hundred media pieces between 83 and 96. And about 2/3 of the things I worked on never saw the light of day because of all the lawyers' letters.
Right.
Now they seem to have changed policy. And, if I was David Miscavige's advisor, I'd be saying, hire the lawyers, go after it again, shut everybody up. But it's too late. Even if he does that, I'm not tremendously taken with what Louis Theroux did, and I know you've made a few comments about it, because it makes us all look like idiots. Right. How would anybody get involved in this? You came away with no real understanding of what Scientology is. It was fascinating seeing Mark Rathbun, in the state he's in, where he's saying, here's bullbait and it gives you forbearance and tolerance, something that he didn't show at any point.
Right.
He was, in a state of blame and rage all the way through, the poor man. Doubtless because he's been harassed so much and still has some conflicts to work out in his own psyche about what he's done with his life, which it's going to be disappointing. It's when, you talk to veterans of foreign wars and you can't say to them, well, Vietnam was a waste of time, because some of their friends died there. It's got to have a meaning. And I think for Mark, it's still got to have a meaning.
Yeah.
And to be able to say, he got as far as saying Hubbard was trying to deify himself, to which I rudely responded with the paragraph that says exactly that in Blue Sky, published in 1990, and explains a little bit more why. But then the next stage is going, so what's auditing for? Is it to release you from, to liberate you, or is it to make you worship Ron Hubbard? And that's all it's for. It has no other function. It never did have, really, other than the occasional spontaneous remission of some ailment or something, which usually comes back 3 days later when the adrenaline opioid response settles.
That's right. Exactly.
So we're seeing a collapse. We're seeing a collapse around the world, but we've got something. I think of the Theosophical Society in, I think it was 1923. They finally, Jiddu Krishnamurti has made the Messiah. And he's given the bank accounts and he gives all the money away. He says, stop it. This is stupid. I'm not a Messiah.
Wow. Well, I was going to ask you about that.
Give the money away.
Yeah, because I'm wondering, I don't want to read too much into this. And I know that in the past couple of years, there have been times where I've gotten quite enthusiastic about the idea of Scientology, collapsing and this sort of thing. And it's got lots of money and it's got lots of time ahead of it. I guess I'm really referring to their sphere of influence when I'm talking about, do you think that Scientology has finally passed a point of no return in that regard, in terms of becoming, moving in a direction of clearing the planet or getting new members or getting people in and that sort of thing? It seems like that's a dead subject to Scientology now.
There's a fundamental teaching in Scientology which says exactly what's going on. You have the birth, the growth, the conservation, the decay, and the death. Right. The conservation phase is the reissuing exactly the same books and tapes over and over again, but because a comma was omitted in the original text. I was looking at somebody who was saying, look, they've perverted the tech. And I went through all of these corrections. It was like, oh, they've corrected the pronoun form of father by putting a capital there.
That's
I don't
right.
think this is really that significant. But in terms of conservation, you have to see it that way. As soon as they made the thing in the desert, they were in the conservation phase. They're now in the decay phase. And to make a comparison with a human being, if you starve a human being, then the organs will be digested. And a couple of years ago, a friend of mine said that one of his quite wealthy friends had been offered some free auditing. And my friend was offered it too and didn't really want to tell them that he wasn't involved anymore, because if you do that, ethics officers can come round and OSA and what have you. So he said, no, thanks for the offer. But he's like, free auditing? I've been involved in Scientology for 20, 30 years. Nobody's ever offered me free auditing before. There's got to be a catch. A week later, his friend who'd accepted the free auditing called him up and said, yeah, it was a sec check. And the sec check, free, was to ask why my kids aren't in the Sea Org. And there's the key. If they're recruiting the children of the celebrities and the wealthy, those kids are not going to last, and they're going to take the poison out of the nest back to their families. And so I think since South Park and the anonymous protests, there is no recruiting, because people just laugh at it. It's just risible,
Exactly.
So it has to maintain. I think Tony was saying that around about March, somebody came out who'd seen the membership lists and said there are now only 25,000 members of the IAS internationally, which has been my prediction for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
I must admit, I use a crystal ball to do this. It's not mathematical, but it's it felt that I don't think there have ever been more than 100,000 members.
I highballed it to 250,000 in the 70s worldwide, and it's debatable, but
it is, because there was a collapse. There was a collapse in 74, which is when I came in, and it's not because I came in. It had happened several months before. In Britain, we'd had the Battle of Britain, where people were locked into a marquee by Alex Sibersky, or Berserksky as he was more popularly known, and I believe he was under orders from Diana Hubbard, who was under orders from L. Ron Hubbard, so I'm not going to blame him. They weren't allowed out until they signed postulate checks, that they were going to give this money. So when I came in, about half the membership had been lost in 74 in Britain. So I don't think there ever was a golden age of tech. I think the highest numbers were in 1950, when 150,000 people bought Dianetics, Modern Science and Mental Health, before the publisher withdrew it because it was fraudulent.
Right.
His auditing hadn't worked, that his conditions had come back, as did everybody else's.
Right.
Almost everybody else's. John McMaster's didn't. He managed to be pain-free for 20 years after his auditing, so he told me.
Right. Well, I think we're definitely running at a. In fact, as I think I said in my most recent video this week, which was all about auditing, that you have a technique here which maybe hits the placebo percentage.
Yeah, about 30%. Yeah.
Yeah, and the point you're making is very, very good, of the fact that people experience relief all the time, only to have it come back a week or two later. I saw that countless times, over and over again, and I failed to note that in my video recently, but it's a very, very good point. Is sure, you experience all kinds of relief, and so do people when they get faith healed. And then they go home. Oh, where are my crutches? I can't get to the kitchen. Sort of.
On the subject of faith healing, the great Derren Brown, who I think has done more to explain these techniques than any person since.
I love that guy,
Harry Houdini. He's just had a show over here called Miracle, which follows up on his US journey, Miracles for Sale, about 10 years ago, where he was adopted by many psychics as having psychic abilities. But one of the things he looked at then was faith healing, and he became fascinated. So during the show Miracle, it's a live show with an audience of, a couple of thousand people or something. And he sends out waves of healing through the audience, having told them that it's bogus, having said, I don't believe in it. And about 200 people line up and have been cured. And you go, oh yeah, well, who knows what's wrong with them. First woman comes on stage, broken back, and she's healed. Next one comes on, dislocated knee, had it since childhood, healed. Guy who's just had an infection of the heart, healed. Just one after another, he puts them through, and then he explains a little bit more what's going on. And he said, he has a woman who he gets her so she can read the tiniest print with her glasses off, healed. And he has a skeptic who comes up from the audience and he says, oh, but you see, you won't be able to read properly, will you? And the guy can't actually read anymore for 2 minutes. Then he explains that basically in a couple of days, the adrenaline opioid response will diminish and sadly, it'll go away.
Right.
You're tapping into something there that is quite wonderful, and we ought to understand better. And if we could incorporate it in our medical techniques, we probably would be doing a lot better than we are. But nonetheless, that spontaneous remission has nothing to do with auditing. It is a byproduct of euphoria achieved through hypnotic states.
Exactly. That's a brilliant little summary right there. So now I'm also wondering how you look at this. So we both pretty much agree that we're looking at a collapse of Scientology in terms of whether it takes 2 years or 20. I really don't care. It's on its way out. That much is clear. I mean, even the way they were responding to Theroux, when he was there at the gold base. I mean, they just,
pathetic.
It was pathetic. It really was.
This is a private road.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's the best they got.
You switch your camera. You switch your camera. It was a very, very kind of gonzo performance, really.
Exactly.
It's about Louis Theroux more than Scientology, but bless him, it was amusing and entertaining.
But I'm wondering now whether we might be seeing in real time maybe a way of, a lot of people, the Scientology has gotten certainly an unwarranted volume of attention given its size and given the fact that it was never really big. And I think that unwarrantedness comes from the fact that it's had some very big celebrities involved with it who have been very outspoken in the past. And so it got a big name for itself. And also because it is considered so dangerous and destructive because of all the litany of techniques that exist within it, right? You have something, pretty wild. And of course, Scientology has lasted longer than a lot of other new religious movements because it's not an Om Shrininko or a Heaven's Gate where they're trying within a few years to kill all their members.
Well, right? Shrininko actually is perhaps bigger now than it ever was.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's disheartening.
Asahara is still leading a group. Particularly in Russia, there are followers.
Wow.
So,
and these guys are these guys are murderers, right? Yeah, it's crazy. But anyway, in terms of Scientology, I'm kind of wondering whether when you look at Scientology, do you see lessons there? You and I have both done lots of analyses of various aspects of Scientology, done a lot of write-ups and videos about different parts of it, and it really offers itself up for a lot of critical analysis because there are so many techniques and stuff going on in it. But now that it's fading, I'm wondering what else it can teach us about the life cycle of destructive cults.
I'm guessing that the comparison would probably be with Christian Science and the New Thought movement that came out of that. So that what we've seen in Scientology from the very beginning, I mean, the first splinter was in 1950 when Dr. Joe Winter, who'd worked very closely with Hubbard throughout 3 months before DMSMH was written, he was there on a daily basis. And he wrote Doctor's Report on Dianetics, basically saying Hubbard is a charlatan. The techniques are great. And that was the first splinter group. In the early 90s, a friend and I sat down and we listed splinter groups, whether they were directly things like Dianology and Ampronistics or Synergetics or co-counsel.
Yeah, I was going to say, because the church certainly has their lists.
Yeah, and boy, do they work on it. You got people like A. Van Vogt and the California Association of Dianetic Auditors. Now, they were pretty much directly working on some of the techniques and then saying we don't like the others. I mean, Van said, I was in touch with him, which is what a privilege. This brilliant writer, A. Van Vogt, who stopped writing to practice Dianetics and never wrote again. And there's a loss to humanity, because he really was, he was not an L. Ron Hubbard. He was a great science fiction writer with a really astonishing mind. But he said, as soon as Hubbard started talking about the spirit, I was gone. Reincarnation, spirit, not interested in that. But
I think my dad called it that Phaeton theory.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
But then there are other groups where a former Scientologist like Werner Erhard, not his real name, or Paul Twitchell, Eckankar. Twitchell was writing professional auditors' bulletins in the 50s, and they go somewhere else. Darfree John. We got about a list of about 200 groups that one way or another were either directly takes of Scientology or they were made by people who'd been potentially harmed by Scientology. It's one way of looking at it, or at least perverted in their thinking in some way. Now we have far more people outside the cult than in it practicing, particularly in Russia and Germany. There are really quite large numbers of people doing this. And
are you referring to independent Scientologists?
That's what they call themselves, but I'm not sure that's the correct word, because as far as I'm concerned, they're dependent. If you're using Scientology, right. You're dependent. You're not self-determined if you're doing that stuff.
Exactly.
I do like that one of them calls itself APIS, which seems the Association of Professional Independent Scientologists. It's like, but not very good at acronyms, evidently. Then there's ADUMP, which is the higher levels. But so those groups are going to keep on. And so the same way that Christian Science created the New Thought movement, those things will go on, and they will, Hubbard's been called the grandfather of the New Age by some authors. I think Aleister Crowley and Alice Bailey deserve that title. Madame Blavatsky deserved that title.
Yeah.
But I think there will be something that continues. The question for me, Wallersheim, Lawrence, he made a few videos for us for the Getting Clear thing in Toronto last year.
Yep.
Which Lawrence is really quite something. He is really quite something. I've never met anybody that determined in my life. How he stood up for over 20 years, given that, I was harassed pretty solidly, but it doesn't compare to what happened to Lawrence and to Jerry Armstrong.
Yep.
And they survived it. They suffered it and survived it. But Lawrence said the only way that Scientology ends is when the ex-members take responsibility and sue it. Because the problem is, you've got a dinosaur with a tiny brain, but it's got billions of dollars, largely invested in buildings, which seems to be their favorite thing. Do you remember the Building Investment Committee of the 80s? That was the first nasty little corporation that I found when I was digging back then.
Yep.
And it was like, why are they giving all of these hundreds of millions of dollars to this other corporation? That's a bit weird. What your donations buy.
Right.
So of course, there's an anomaly. What your donations buy, that issue was originally called what your fees buy.
Exactly.
And changed the word to,
right.
That's all he changed. But they've got all of this money. Until the money is gone, the power will be there. I presume that David Miscavige will not live a long and healthy life. I think that the steroid challenges he had as a kid because of his asthma and, the continuation of that may well mean that he doesn't live much longer. Certainly his apoplectic rages are not helpful towards a long life.
No,
and
for sure.
There is no successor. So the possibility is always there, as so many defectors have said, we'll go and reform it. Well, good luck with that. The best way to reform Scientology is to empty the bank accounts,
right.
To give the money back, to find out, who's been damaged and give them something in response. So my cat's decided to come in and meow at us.
Yes, of course. Well, we're almost done. I wanted to ask you just two last things.
Let me just fix that notion that back in '88, Hannah Whitfield and the Stansfields, various people brought together a class of, I think it was 420 people, called Freedom for All in Religion. Sadly, they were a little naive, and they couldn't make a class of themselves. And I said, well, the class is the state of clear, because that is not a religious claim. It is a psychotherapeutic physical claim. It's a modern science of mental health. Lawyers, like 6 months later, when asked why the suit had failed, Hannah said, we didn't want to denigrate the state of clear, because they're all still earning their money from auditing. Now we've got enough people away from it, then there should be, I think there should be a class action, a massive class action to actually take the funds away. I'm not volunteering, by the way.
Right.
Suggestion. I think the other
whoever's
thing,
the people who get involved in that, better buckle down, because it's going to be years to pull off something like that.
It'd be 15 to 20 years probably. But if, accepting that there are perhaps 2 million people who've been involved, 2, maybe 3 million people who've had some auditing along the way. And I would reckon probably at least 250,000 people really have suffered harm, at least that many, from the 30-year Sea Org members through to the people who followed the advice about auditing and,
Right.
people who are bankrupted and all of that. So, I also think it's very important to focus on the rich Scientologists. And I've been saying this again and again, rather than anonymous protesting at orgs, they should protest outside the Feshbach's office building. They should protest outside the studios, wherever crews. And then they draw media. You only need 5 people to do this. You don't need a huge crowd. And they hand out leaflets, and I have written one. They hand out leaflets basically saying what Scientology is and saying, if you put money in the Feshbach's business, then you are supporting Scientology. And if you support Scientology, you are putting money into the war chest. And the war chest is used to hurt people who dare speak out about Scientology. So you're actually involved in a terrible criminal situation, quite by accident, by accepting these people. And I think that would maybe turn those people to look in on Scientology and say, you need to reform. You need to stop doing this stuff, But
well, that seems to be, as they're pulling their flippers in, they seem to be less and less out there, in full-blown attack mode, which is kind of to be expected. I mean, the number of resources they have are dwindling. But
the amount of money they have, the problem is that, when the Guardian's office were sent to dig ditches at Gilman Hot Springs back in 1982-83, they didn't take branch 1. They took public relations, social coordination, finance. I talked with quite a number of people along the way who were on that program, people from legal, geolegal. There was nobody there from branch 1. There was nobody there who had been involved in the stuff that they were being sent to prison for. And indeed, in the years that followed, 10 years later, I was still being followed by Peter Stumkey, who had been head of branch 1 in the UK when it fell. Miles Mellor was still active for years. So what happened was that the harassment network was moved out to be external. And Eugene Ingram in the US and John Ingram here, no relation.
Right.
Curious, though. They ran operations. I've talked to somebody who was in OSA in the mid-90s here, who was paying over thousands of pounds in cash to a private detective who had infiltrated counter-cult groups and was reporting back on them.
Right.
So I think now with their hacking capacity, with their ability, you had the 2 cases last year, Tony Ortega being one of them, where a guy was sent to jail in New York.
That's right.
And the judge, nobody was willing to investigate, even though the 2 people who'd been hacked were both critics of Scientology.
Right.
So I think they probably are reading our email, and they probably are trying to, like the KGB. The KGB had fantastic collection abilities that you couldn't say anything they didn't know. But thankfully, as with Scientology, they were so paranoid that they didn't trust each other to interpret it properly, But so I don't think that the harassment stopped. I think it's moved to a different place.
Okay.
And certainly the divide and conquer and turning people against each other, which is the standard operating procedure of
that seems to be alive and well. And within the ex-Scientology world, there are some agitators who seem to be bent on creating, kerfluffles for no real good reason that I can see,
No,
but it does.
Either because they're damaged by Scientology or were damaged before Scientology, or they, there's a sleeper thing. I found that I had 5 agents in my life in 1993, 5 people. One of them was my driver. And things were being stolen. My house was being broken into. All sorts of things were going on. As this guy he'd taken a room across the street from me so he could have a camera on all the time so that anybody who visited me would be recorded. And you get that this low-level stuff is going on all of the time. And, I'm not sure that that's gone away because they now have the money to do it really well. Look at the money that was spent on Pat Broker. What, $11 million?
No, you're absolutely right, and it's actually a cautionary tale to not you're bringing up very good points, and I shouldn't be so quick to assume that just because there isn't smoke doesn't mean there isn't fire. That's That's
And
good.
the only response that I've ever had is to presume that, you know, there's a microphone in one of my teeth and everything I say is being recorded.
Exactly. That's pretty much
So
how
you
I've
have
been
to
living
be
my life
ethical.
anyway, you know.
You have to be ethical, you have to be decent, you have to have the proper values. You
Right.
know, so I mean last year Jerry Armstrong criticized me from the stage for saying that I'm not in any kind of battle or crusade or fight, and I never have been. He said, it is, and you've got to be. And I understand his point of view, but as I said to him at breakfast the next day, you know, if you convinced me of that attitude, I would leave the scene, because I'm not going to be a crusader and I'm not going to fight. And who would I be fighting? As far as I'm concerned, everybody in Scientology is a victim. Everybody.
Exactly. Yeah,
You
exactly.
know, even Miscavige, even Hubbard to some extent, though I'm not sure how kindly, you know, my attitude towards him would have been.
Right. Yeah. My compassion only extends so far. There are a couple people that I don't know that I would ever forgive, but that is a very small list. I do agree with you in broad terms that the majority of people in that group are there because because of undue influence, not because they purposefully chose to go be evil, you know.
Yeah. And I think what Yuval says about Hubbard and temporal lobe epilepsy is probably true. I went through the 18 criteria on the Bear Video list with him last year, and I've been back through, you know, again with him. And Hubbard had all of the traits. I mean, the hypergraphia, for example, he is in the Guinness Book of World Records as the world's most prolific writer.
Right.
And not necessarily the best, but the most prolific. You know, never mind the quality, feel the width. You know,
exactly. Yeah, he was certainly good at putting stuff out there.
But recent work in the last 10 years, particularly Kent Kyle's work, maybe James Fallon, they have absolutely proved to my satisfaction that criminal psychopaths have a deteriorated paralimbic system in the brain. And Kyle has actually done hundreds of CAT scans on criminal psychopaths to show this. Great book called The Psychopath Whisperer. And so we may well have all been duped by a man who was brain damaged. You know, he had temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a lesion in the temporal lobe. And he was a narcissist of the vulnerable category from my research, somebody who's going, oh, God, nobody loves me. Which, you know, I talked to so many people who were intimate with him who said that same thing, you know, that behind closed doors, he'd be crying and he'd be refusing to get out of bed for 3 days and drinking another bottle of whiskey. Right from Barbara Cloden, who lived with him in 1950, through to Jim Lynn Kelsey, who was with him in 72, 73, nursing him. And up to the end, you know, John McMaster said the same thing, John Sanborn, one after another, people saying, you know, he wants to be admired more than anything. He wants people to love him because he is so unlovable, you know.
So yeah, there's some interesting possibilities opening up from what you're talking about and the research that's being done into a more compassionate look at those who do and commit evil.
Yes.
So, you know, those who do things that are socially unacceptable. And we've had this very black and white sort of approach to things, which is fairly primitive, really, of there's good people and there's evil people, you know. And yet maybe our research will show that, no, there's people whose brains are screwed up and they were born that way and they never got out of the gate with a chance.
Yeah,
and it's not to say you don't segregate those people or do something about them when they're doing bad things, but the understanding of why they're doing that might become more compassionate as we learn more about it.
Well, Ken Kyle talks about a program which I think was in Wyoming, which involved quite a lot of juvenile offenders who were diagnosed with callous and unemotional disorder, which is, until you're 18, that's what you're called if you're a psychopath, because they don't want to label you. And they found that compared to the control group over a period of several years, there were far less offences committed by the group who'd been given massive treatment. And that treatment was all psychotherapy, compassion, care and concern. James Fallon is a neuroscientist, very successful neuroscientist, who discovered that his brain was the brain of a sociopath. And he basically had to say, yes, this is true. And having grown up and got into his 50s and a professor of neuroscience, believing that everything is genetic, everything is nature, he had to change his mind, because the reality is that his mother realized there was something wrong with him when he was an infant and treated him in a very careful way. So while he calls himself a pro-social sociopath, and he's contributed wonderful things, and he says, yes, I'm a risk taker. Yes, I don't invite me to a funeral because I'll go to a party instead. I don't care what you think. However, it shows us a way that possibly we can adopt these people and, use them in some way. For me, I was talking to my 14-year-old about this, and he said, 14-year-old little swat, I don't know where he gets it from. But he said to me, so sociopaths wouldn't have groupthink, would they? It's like, oh my God, I've been studying this for decades, and of course they wouldn't. And you then think of Irving Janis and the groupthink argument, and his solution is you put a devil's advocate in every group. Well, who's a better devil's advocate than a pro-social sociopath? Because they don't care what you think. They don't care. The other point you make, black and white thinking is an aspect of cult membership. We say it so often, and then we do it. Say these people are psychopaths. In fact, I think it's, as with Simon Baron-Cohen's work on the autistic spectrum, it's a spectrum, and we're all on it somewhere in different ways. So we all have a certain degree of affective empathy, something that sociopaths don't have at all. They don't care, but, on the Asperger's or autism spectrum, they generally have high affective empathy. They have strong feelings, but they don't have high cognitive empathy, theory of mind, the ability to see what other people are doing, whereas sociopaths have fantastic cognitive
That's
empathy.
right. That's right.
So I think there are different measures, and I think the whole psychiatric nonsense of diagnosing people according to symptoms is about to go, because we're now understanding actual physical problems.
Right.
So, in fact, DSM, the last DSM, which was only 2012, antisocial personality disorder has replaced psychopathic. The word psychopath is not used, but it's still listed as a disorder. Well, if it's brain damage, it's not a disorder. It's not a personality disorder. It's not something that's been acquired. It's something that's inborn, that's innate.
Right.
But we can
and that's where these interdisciplinary works are so important, where psychology and neurology need to come together on this stuff. And even something I talked about on another podcast recently with Kevin DePlant was on critical thinking, how critical thinking has mainly been the province of logic and rhetoric in college. And yet, if you don't bring the psychology and the cognitive studies in on it, you're not going to be an effective critical thinker or, speaker if you don't understand, cognitive problems like cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias and things like that are not taught in your rhetoric class.
Yes.
So
absolutely. And instead you're going to be reading speeches by Cicero and Aristotle's ideas, which are very interesting, but we know a lot more now. We know so much more.
Exactly. All right, Jon. Well, we are definitely out of time. This has been fascinating. I love chatting with you. It's always interesting.
Do it again.
Yes, we definitely will. And Open Minds Foundation. It is what? www.openmindsfoundation.org. Okay, good.
And my book is Opening Minds.
Yep. And that's on Amazon.
Yep.
Where do they get
on
that?
Kindle. If anybody bought the original edition last November or since last November, they can just update their Kindle. There are 2 new chapters because I realized I hadn't said anything about the people who do it. So I went and read books. This is why I can talk about sociopaths so readily, because I've just gone and read 4 books about it. And I wrote also a chapter about the family, because I think, parental alienation is a subject that's really come up with Open Minds. We have a psychiatrist called Nick Child, who's a wonderful, wonderful man. And he has dealt with, these situations where an adult is saying, I hate my father never had anything to do with me. And, the mother has got a wardrobe full of gifts and, Christmas cards and birthday cards that were never given to the child, and has created tremendous animosity. And you are there seeing undue influence writ very large indeed.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I've extended the book a little. I've also changed the chapter on hypnosis because it's such a difficult thing to talk about because it's a word that goes vampire, you know.
That's
as
right.
soon as you say it, it's such a snarl word. So I've moved over to the Oxford Dictionary's definition, the Oxford Handbook's definition, which is guided imagination, which I think, you know, moves it over to what we're really doing and what we're doing all the time, 24 hours a day.
Interesting. Good. Well, that sounds fascinating. People check it out. And we will talk again soon, Jon. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And so that was my interview with Jon Atack. I hope you enjoyed that, found it informative, educational, and entertaining. This next week, I have an interview already in the can as well for 7 days from now with David Nyos from the American Humanists Association. And that is some fascinating stuff. So I think you guys are going to enjoy that. Look forward to it. And if you have not been spreading the good news about the Sensibly Speaking podcast, please do so. Share it far and wide across the interwebs. Your good word of mouth about my podcast, I think, will get more attention, more viewership, and more good, sensible thinking and critical thinking going on out there. Thanks a lot for coming around. I very much look forward to any and all feedback you have about the show. Go ahead and leave it in the comments section on my YouTube channel or in the comments on sensiblyspeaking.com. See you guys next week.